fall of 2005, I visited a professor's office. I was a first semester political science graduate student at the University of Memphis. And I was still trying to figure out a way to deliver on a desire that had been with me for a long time. A desire to help others thrive in the face of discrimination, abuse, and neglect, much of which I had seen growing up, but luckily not experienced myself. I had tried out a few careers to do this, things like teaching and medicine. I tried out youth counseling. But none of them had really felt right to me. So now, on a friend's suggestion, I was here. Professor David Richards listened to me patiently from across his desk as I tried to nervously explain to him the project I was working on. I was in a class that was focused on American foreign policy, and what I was trying to do was figure out if a country's human rights record would affect whether or not the United States gave that country economic assistance. When I was done describing my project, Dr. Richards asked me if maybe I thought I would want to work in the field of human rights someday, to which I replied something along the lines of, well, I want to make things better in the United States, and human rights are just about other places where things are way worse. Dr. Richards just laughed and told me I was a human rights person. I just didn't know it yet. Now, I argued with him about this a little bit, and, ultimately I promised, sure, I'll give human rights a try. I'll take your class next semester. And it turns out, as you may have suspected, Dr. Richards was right, and I was wrong. I am a human rights person. In fact, since I took his class, I've kind of worked on nothing else. I've just focused on human rights. I ended up pursuing a PhD in political science so that I could study human rights, and I've worked on multiple measurement projects, all aimed at improving global respect for human rights around the world. Today, I'm an associate professor of international affairs and the director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues, right here at the University of Georgia. Now, you may have heard me telling my story and found yourself agreeing with the younger version of me. Maybe you care deeply about ending poverty, or eradicating preventable disease, or preventing police violence. But you've always thought about human rights as something distant, something reserved for people suffering unthinkable atrocities in places far, far away from you. Well, I'm here to tell you, you're actually a human rights person. You just may not know it yet. You see, I think a lot of us in the United States have some misconceptions about what human rights mean for us. Maybe it's due to nationalism, or due to the fact that we've been in a country that's told us over and over again that it's the greatest one in the world, ever since grade school. But I think most of us go through our day-to-day lives and we think our rights are protected. If our rights weren't protected, we'd notice, right? Well, the truth of the matter is, most of us would never notice our rights weren't protected unless we found ourselves in the unfortunate position of having those rights violated or being denied the benefits of those rights. And even then, if we tried to compare our circumstances to what they could be if we enjoyed all of our rights, I think we struggle to do so. If we can make that comparison, I think we would see that our human rights haven't been fully guaranteed in the United States. And even some of those that are legally guaranteed are frequently violated. We have to change our mindset about what human rights are and what they can mean for our daily lives. Now, when I use the phrase human rights, what I'm referring to is the list of rights that have been approved internationally at the United Nations, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, that's a long list consisting of civil and political rights, like the right to participate in government, the right to be free from torture, or the right to express yourself freely, but also economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to a job, the right to health care, or the right to education. Human rights also include your right to be free from discrimination on the basis of your race, your gender, your ethnicity, or any other status you may have. All in all, human rights are those things you're entitled to because you're a person. That means they're universal, and they apply to all people at all times. And they're interdependent, which means you probably need to enjoy all of them to fully enjoy any of them. To quote my favorite definition of human rights, which comes from an old United Nations pamphlet, human rights are inherent in our nature. They allow us to fully develop and to use our human qualities, our intelligence, our talents, and our conscience and to satisfy our spiritual and other needs. To co-opt a phrase from a large American institution, if you fully enjoy your human rights, you'll have the ability to be all you can be. And if your government won't let you live a life that's worthy of the dignity of a person, human rights will give you a universal moral standard to appeal to. If you care about living in a world where people live with dignity, where their rights are respected, where they don't have to worry about whether they have food or whether they'll die from a preventable disease, guess what? You're a human rights person. Now, in principle, every government in the world is subject to the list of human rights laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was approved without any votes against it on December 10th, 1948 at the United Nations. Further, the vast majority of governments in the world have taken those rights in that Universal Declaration and turned them into international law through various treaties. So with all these commitments, you might think our governments care deeply about ensuring that we always enjoy all of our rights, but that's frequently not the case. A lot of the time, our governments don't keep their human rights promises. And they don't do it because there often aren't enough of us monitoring them to make sure that they do. Human rights rarely make the news unless there's a crisis. Instead, we frequently hear things about cultural events and cultural influence, or security and military power, or economic growth and development. Here in the United States, we're told that the United States is a cultural powerhouse with more cultural influence than maybe any other country on the planet. And by most indicators, the United States has the most powerful military in the world. But I would argue that the way the media seems to judge policy most often is by economic growth and development. And yes, the United States is the richest country in the world. But for those of us that live in this very rich country, I think we often find ourselves worrying about the state of the economy, or thinking that we might be headed towards a recession, or keeping track of unemployment and inflation statistics. We do that because if the economy took a turn for the worse, or if we suddenly found ourselves without a job, most of us are afraid that we might find ourselves victims to violence, or that we might not be able to keep our homes, or that we might not have access to healthcare or education. You see, our concerns about the economy are real, but they're based in these very real fears that we won't enjoy our basic human rights. And ultimately, it seems like we're depending on the economy to be good to fulfill our human rights, rather than depending on our governments who promise that they would fulfill those very things for us in the worst of times. And also, if it's really human rights that's motivating all of our concerns and all of our fears in this area, then why do we spend so much of our time talking about other stuff and not talking about human rights? Well, I would argue it's because we've had data on those other things, and we often haven't had data on human rights. You see, we depend on governments to give us data on most of the most important things, but governments don't want to collect data on their own fulfillment of human rights. Asking governments to give us data on their fulfillment of human rights is a little like collecting crime statistics by just asking everybody to tell us all the bad things they've ever done. There's good reason to guess that those numbers are going to get fudged. So, if we can't depend on governments or the international institutions that governments work through to provide us with human rights data, then the responsibility for collecting those data falls on people like us. Now, we're never going to know the exact number of people that were abused in prisons last year, or the number of people who've been denied the right to vote. We just don't have the resources that governments have to know that kind of information. But what we lack in government resources, we can make up for with empathy and effort and innovation. And in fact, there is a large global human rights community of advocates, practitioners, journalists, lawyers, and others, all of whom are trying their very best to collect human rights information. So back in 2015, I teamed up with two economists, Anne-Marie Brooke and Susan Randolph. And we started trying to think about how we could work with that large community to produce human rights data. We saw the need for international collaboration between human rights advocates and human rights scholars. And so we founded the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or HRMI for short, which tries to do just that. HRMI produces collaborative, comprehensive, and independent data on a range of human rights for countries all over the world. And our ultimate goal is to collect data for every country in the world on every single human right in the core UN human rights treaties. So, what happens if we take data like Hermes and we look at the world through a human rights lens rather than an economic growth lens? Well, at least for the United States, it looks quite different. You see, for Hermes Rights Tracker investor data, which we collected for 2021 on safety from state violence, the United States ranked 114th out of 195 countries, far behind every other high-income democracy. I want to say that again. Somewhere around 113 countries tortured, killed, disappeared, or arbitrarily imprisoned people less than the United States in 2021. Now, if we look at other civil and political rights, like the right to participate in government, or the right to assemble and associate, or the right to free expression, the United States does a little bit better. But it still only ranks 43rd out of the 178 countries we have data on those rights. I think far behind what most of us would expect. And while the United States is the richest country in the world, it ranks in the bottom 11 countries that are high-income democracies on every single economic and social right you can find on Hermes Rights Tracker. And the United States comes in dead last, 34th out of 34 high-income democracies on the right to health. All in all, the United States is the worst performing high-income democracy that Hermes has data on. Beyond that, you might think that at least the United States throws its weight around in the international sphere for human rights, but we've actually largely sat on the sideline there as well. Out of 18 major UN human rights treaties, the United States has only ratified 5 of them. Likewise, out of 171 countries that have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the United States has not. It's the only large, high-income democracy that has failed to ratify that document. There are only 8 countries in the world that have failed to ratify the Women's Rights Convention, and the United States is one of them. And there's literally only 1 country in the world that has failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's the United States. These failures should teach us 2 lessons. First, human rights in the United States are less guaranteed and less respected than they are in many countries all over the world. And second, by sitting on the sidelines of the international human rights movement, the United States has failed to bring its economic power and its cultural influence to help everyone enjoy their human rights everywhere. So I think at this point it's clear that human rights data, human rights information is relevant not just for thinking about how we improve lives all over the world, but how we can improve them right here at home. And while information like this is useful and helpful in terms of understanding the world, I think we can do more with it than that. We can actually use it to affect real change. For example, you can use human rights data to determine where to spend and how to invest your money. You can ask yourself not only where your money can do the most good for yourself, but also where it could do the most good for others. Just this past year, the World Bank started including Hermes data in its platform for investors that are concerned about the environmental, social, and governance impacts of their investments, in the hope that those investors will start including human rights as an important determinant of their investment decisions. You can also use human rights data to educate yourself and others about human rights issues. You can use human rights data as a jumping off point for op-eds or articles for your local newspaper. Or you can share human rights infographics on social media in the hopes that you can inform your neighbors, your friends, your family, and your followers about human rights issues. You can also directly just work with human rights projects that are aimed at collecting these data, or you can donate to them in the hopes that your donation can help them expand and continue. But probably most importantly, you can use human rights data to influence your government and ask them to have better policies and better practices. Some examples of this include the Parents of the Vision Impaired group in New Zealand that have used Hermie data to advocate for better treatment of people with disabilities. Or the 88 Project, which used Hermie data to advocate for more freedom of expression in Vietnam. Or Human Rights Pulse, that's used Hermie data to draw attention to human rights abuses right here in the United States. And thinking about the United States, we should be able to use human rights data to show our leaders just how far short we're falling on human rights practices. We should be able to use those data to lobby for better practices and policies from our government. We should be able to use information about human rights to elect officials that actually care about these things. And if necessary, we can use human rights data to motivate peaceful protest. Research tells us that if we respect human rights more, economic growth will follow. But we can strengthen that relationship and make it more important by just using human rights to make our decisions in the first place. My vision, and now I kind of hope our shared vision, right, is of a world where countries compete not just on who can have the most powerful military or the fastest economic growth, but who can treat people the best. It's a world where discrimination isn't tolerated, where people don't have to worry about hunger or housing, and where people don't fear that governments will turn their weapons on their inhabitants. It's a world where the economy is properly placed as a means for achieving human rights rather than an end in itself. We deserve to be free from abuse, violence, and coercion, to have quality education, to have the highest attainable standard of health, be paid adequate wages, to travel and move freely, to freely express ourselves, to participate in our government, to be free from poverty, to have rest time and leisure, to participate in the cultural life of our nation, and to do all of that free from discrimination. We have to change our mindsets to start thinking about human rights in our daily lives. And I think if we can do that, we might all be able to enjoy the world as we should. So for one last reminder, if you care about anything on this list, you're a human rights person. And now you know it. Thank you so much.